everybody for coming. Thank you for the introduction, and I'm going to go ahead and get started. My topic is called Why Wait, where we'll be discussing a handful of popular fad diets and then healthier diets in order to manage weight. And hopefully I'll be able to answer your questions regarding weight loss or, different things related to cancer nutrition as we go through this. So I'm trying to advance my slides and they are not going. I don't know why. Oh, there we go. Okay, figured it out. All right, so just to review, the mission statement for the cancer support community is to ensure that all people impacted by cancer are empowered by knowledge, strengthened by action, and sustained by community. I've been a volunteer for the cancer support community for roughly 10 years. I've been doing cooking demos for them on that third Saturday of the month. So once we are able to join back in person, hopefully I'll see you there, or you'll see me online sometime in November. In order to complete the presentation on time, I ask that you just hold your questions until the end, if you don't mind, unless you can't hear or you need me to repeat something. And if there's any unanswered questions, please email me at lisa@soundbitesnutrition.com and just put in the subject heading CSC questions, so I sort of know what that is. I do get quite a bit of email, some good, some bad, some spam, just like everybody else. So the objectives tonight are to review 3 popular fad diets that you probably hear frequently about, give you some pros and cons of each, and then to cite 3 benefits of the Mediterranean DASH diet and intermittent fasting, which are a little healthier versions, but becoming more mainstream, and then to review some benefits of exercise. So just to kind of give you a little background on myself, I became a dietitian almost 30 years ago, primarily because I love food, I love people, and I love science. My father unfortunately had diabetes and passed away about, it'll be 18 years this January from complications of diabetes. And I also watched my mom struggle with her weight for several years. She's still alive, she's 85. And even just recently, she's 84. I just spoke with her the other day and she mentioned that cottage cheese and fat is fattening, and I just about cringed. So she probably has been on several of these different diets that I'm going to talk about, going through some of the diets over history. So my typical patients, I do see clients one-on-one. I also do some freelance writing and cooking demos, as I mentioned. So my typical patients are weight loss patients, people with prediabetes or diabetes, polycystic ovary syndrome, cardiovascular diseases, gastrointestinal issues, and then I do see a fair number of people that are either going through or have experienced cancer. So just to kind of review some of the statistics that we have on obesity, roughly 70% of Americans are either overweight or obese, which comes out to be over 150 million Americans. And of that 150 million, roughly a third of them are going on a diet every year. So just because somebody is overweight or obese doesn't necessarily mean that they are trying to do anything about it, but roughly about a third of people are. As far as cost goes, we do recognize that Americans spend over $70 billion a year on weight loss, and that includes things like supplements, maybe joining a gym, hiring a trainer, hiring a dietitian, going on a fad diet, asking their doctor for weight loss supplements. So it's a $70 billion a year industry. So people are always trying to figure out what's the magic bullet, and there really isn't one, to be honest. Over $930 million go into research funding on overweight and obesity, which includes medications, therapies, cognitive behavioral therapies, exercise, as well as diet research itself. And then we know that healthcare costs go up between 147 to over 200 million, or rather billion per year on healthcare because of complications related to weight issues. We also have a childhood obesity epidemic. So this is not to be taken lightly, but kids are getting heavier and they're starting to see children, especially in their teenage years, start to suffer adult onset conditions, things like high blood pressure, type 2 diabetes, arthritis. These are becoming more common as kids become more overweight, which is really sad to see because that shortens their life expectancy. So just to kind of give you an overview of fad diets, and as I mentioned, my mother probably did, I don't know how many of these different diets, but some of these are going to look familiar to you. I'm not going to run through all of these. The slides will be available after the presentation. Well, the Cancer Sports Center has them, and I'll send them as a PDF to be sent to you if you're interested. But, you know, we've heard of the Dr. Atkins diet, for example, was around in the 70s, but really did become popular again, at least in my lifetime, until, you know, the 1990s up until, you know, early 2000s. So some of these diets tend to repeat themselves. So things like the cabbage soup diet, you'll hear that on and off when people are trying to lose weight. Ketogenic diet has been around for quite a long time, although it was not necessarily named the ketogenic diet. So a lot of these things tend to repeat themselves over time. So tonight I'm just going to cover some of the more popular diets that you hear about, including the keto diet, the paleo diet, which is probably lost a little bit of favor as people have kind of been curbing their carb intake. Something called the Whole30 that was popular in the past few years, and then go over the benefits of the Mediterranean diet, the DASH diet, and intermittent fasting. So just to sort of start with, the ketogenic diet was actually discovered in the 20s, and it was used to treat epilepsy, and it's still used in pediatric populations as well as people dealing with brain cancer sometimes, to reduce the risk of seizures. So the first trial, or the first trials with the ketogenic diet, were actually way back in the 1920s. The diet itself is very high fat. It's roughly 75 to 80% of the calories come from fat. About 25% of the calories come from protein, and minimal amount of calories come from carbohydrate. So the diet itself is very limited. You can have vegetables, but they need to be low carb vegetables. So things like spinach, cabbage, mushrooms, kale, celery, those are all okay. But you can't have any starchy vegetables. So no peas, no corn, no lima beans. Those are certainly limited. You can have any sort of animal food. So beef, fish, poultry, chicken, seafood, dairy products, with the exception of yogurt, because yogurt does contain some carbohydrates, and so that is limited in the diet. No grains at all are on this particular diet. So no potatoes, no rice, no corn, no wheat, no bulgur, no quinoa, none of those things that we know are healthy in our diets. Avocados are fine for this diet because the calories come primarily from fat. Bacon and butter are okay on this diet. Excuse me, coconut, unsweetened, however. Nuts in small amounts, low carb protein drinks, coffee, tea, and a limited amount of berries are allowed in the diet because they do tend to be a lower carbohydrate fruit. So the way that the diet works is that your pancreas makes or creates two different hormones that manage your blood sugar. So one we know of is insulin, that helps lower blood sugar, and the other is glucagon. And glucagon actually helps to raise your blood sugar. So when your body's blood sugar is going low, glucagon talks to your liver in order to release carbohydrate through a process called gluconeogenesis in order to provide sugar for your cells. So when you don't have any carbohydrate in your diet, or you don't have any glycogen, which is carbohydrate in storage, glucagon gets released and tells the liver to produce something called ketone bodies, or ketones, which come from the breakdown of fat. Now, while that sounds great, those ketones are not really a complete breakdown of fat. So in order to break down fat completely, you actually need a little bit of carbohydrate for it to be produced, you know, for it to completely break down into fatty acids and triglycerols, which can be used for energy. So ketones can be used for energy, but they are somewhat toxic to the body. So they do put some stress on your kidneys. For people that have diabetes, ketosis is a dangerous situation. So again, how the keto diet works is that carbohydrates are normally stored in the liver as glycogen, which is just a big word for carbohydrate and storage. And those are broken down through a process called glycogenolysis, which is just a chemical process that releases glucose from glycogen for energy. So when you're in a state of fasting in between meals, your body uses that glycogen for energy. So glycogen holds a lot of water. So when you reduce your carbohydrate intake and you don't have any glycogen stores left, you actually have what we call sort of a diuresis, where your body is losing some water. So that initial weight loss with a very low carb diet is often just fluid. So again, you don't have carbs, you don't have glycogen, you're going to lose some water because that glycogen holds a lot of water, so it's being depleted from the body. When you don't have any carbs in your diet, your fat cells will break down to ketones for energy. The ketones go to urine, and after a handful of days, roughly about 2 to 7 days of a low carb diet, you go into something called ketosis, which can be somewhat uncomfortable. So a lot of people feel like they have the flu. So they feel nauseous, they might have some fatigue because again, they're not using carbohydrate for energy, their body's trying to struggle and use these ketones. So after a few weeks of the diet, you will experience what's called sort of the keto flu. So some of the benefits, obviously you lose weight. There was a fairly decent study, a couple different studies that found that people with insulin resistance, so dieters that are more prone to diabetes, that have insulin resistance, respond pretty well to a keto diet, but it doesn't mean that they have to go completely low carb in order to lose weight. It also helps to lower your blood sugar because it improves insulin resistance. So when you eat carbohydrates, your body's response is to secrete insulin in order to lower blood sugar. If you don't have those carbs in your diet, you don't have as much insulin being necessary for the cells to use in order to use the carbohydrate for energy. Something called a Mediterranean keto diet might actually help patients with polycystic ovary syndrome. And again, this is going to be pretty restrictive, but a Mediterranean diet would include more green leafy vegetables, fish, avocados, olives, and nuts, but still very minimal grains. As I mentioned before, the diet has been used to reduce seizures. It's used sometimes with children with epilepsy, and it's also been used for patients with brain cancer. And again, because it helps to reduce seizures. Some of the negatives, and these are pretty big negatives, obviously the diet lacks fiber, vitamins, minerals, B vitamins, potassium, calcium, vitamin D, pretty much all of the nutrients that your body needs to kind of function. Another big side effect is constipation because you're not getting any dietary fiber or very minimal dietary fiber. It puts some stress on your bowels. There's been a few studies that show that it may actually increase the risk of diabetes, particularly in animal studies. We've seen some insulin resistance with this sort of diet. So the studies, what we'll say is that they're sort of equivocal. We have some pros where it say, that say it might reduce the risk of diabetes, but then on the flip side, it may raise the risk in some people. The other thing, and this was a really big study that came out a few years ago, found that when your carbohydrate intake is really high, meaning over 70% of the calories coming from carbohydrates, or it's low, and this really isn't that low, but 40% of your calories coming from carbohydrate, they found that when people were eating on either end of those extremes, that they had the highest rates of mortality. So higher rates of heart disease, higher rates of cancer, higher rates of dying from other causes when your diet is really high in carbohydrates, and that would probably be more with really refined carbohydrates. So all the stuff that we're supposed to limit when we're trying to lose weight, cake, pie, cookies, donuts, regular soda, those sorts of things. But also even limiting your carbohydrate intake to 40% or less can raise your risk for mortality. And again, it's probably related to the lack of fruits and vegetables and grains that are high in fiber that are protective. The other thing to consider is it's a very restrictive diet. So how sustainable is this? Personally, I've seen lots of clients go on and off this diet only to gain more weight back. So in the long run, I'm not sure if it's really worth trying. So now we'll talk about the paleo diet. It's also known as a caveman or Stone Age diet or a hunter-gatherer diet. Um, this diet is based on the assumption that these foods were available to humans before agriculture, before farming. Um, the diet was sort of traced back to 1975 by initially by a gastroenterologist, and then further developed by somebody named Stanley Boyd Eaton and Melvin Connor in 1985. And then it became popular again by a doctor, a PhD doctor named Lauren Cordain. So some of the claims from the paleo diet are that it helps with weight loss, it helps to increase your energy and may improve your skin. And some of those are true, but some of them may or may not be true. The basics of a paleo diet, I want to make sure I didn't skip one. Okay. Things that are okay to eat on a paleo diet, it's very meat-centric. So meat, fish, chicken, eggs. For some reason, you're allowed to have fruit. So that's a little healthier, obviously, than a keto diet because you can't have fruit. You're allowed vegetables, you're allowed nuts, you're allowed butter, coconut oil, minimal alcohol because it does contain, obviously, some sugar. You can't have any grains, none. So again, no potatoes, no corn, no rice. No pasta, no quinoa, no bulgur, no barley, no farro, all those different ancient grains, none of those are allowed. You can't have any beans or lentils. And for me, this is a really big sticking point because there's been so many great studies on the benefits of adding pulses. This is sort of the formal term that us foodies are using. Beans and lentils are often known as pulses. And there's some good data that those help with weight management and blood sugar regulation. No dairy products, mostly starchy vegetables are not allowed, no sweets, no vegetable oil or hydrogenated oil, and obviously no sugary or boozy drinks. So you can't really have a pina colada on this type of diet. So do you lose weight? When compared with traditional low-fat or calorie-controlled diets, the weight loss is really similar. So it's not really any better and it's not really any worse. It may reduce acne in some people, particularly teenagers, because dairy products tend to increase the risk for insulin resistance in teenagers. And so the diet has shown that it may reduce acne in certain populations. It may improve symptoms of irritable bowel disease, or rather inflammatory bowel disease. There's a small study called an autoimmune protocol diet that includes tenets of a paleo diet where it does show symptoms of IBD improved. And my take on that is that because it reduces things like beans that are gassy, and that it reduces grains that can also be fermentable, and dairy products are also fermentable, and those types of foods can cause gas in certain populations. When exercise is included with this type of diet, the risk for cardiovascular disease is decreased. So again, some of these diets do have some benefits, but again, we want to look at how restrictive they are. So again, some of the negatives, it really has a one-size-fits-all approach. So if you're somebody that does have gastrointestinal issues, it may or may not help you. If you're somebody with diabetes, it may or may not help you. The other thing to consider is that it's pretty liberal in animal protein, which does increase the risk for cardiovascular disease. In the long run, we also worry about your gut microbiome, which relies on dietary fiber. So when you're reducing your intake of whole grains and beans and dairy products like yogurt, that's going to alter your gut microbiome, which is pretty important to maintain your immune function over time. The other thing to consider with the paleo diet is your carbs are necessary for brain development. So diets of early ancestors were very different depending on where they lived. So we're not 100% sure that they didn't have any grains, because how did their brains develop if they didn't eat grains? The other thing to consider is that remnants of different grains were found on Paleolithic tools and instruments and cooking tools. So we know that they consumed different types of grains. So the theory that this is what people ate is not 100% accurate based on science. Another popular diet is called the Whole30, and this was actually developed by two personal trainers. They're a husband and wife, and they had a top-selling book on Amazon for quite a while that also included a Whole30 cookbook. Oh, going the wrong way there. So the diet suggests for 30 days you're supposed to avoid all processed and packaged foods, no MSG, monosodium glutamate, no beans, no legumes, no dairy products, nothing with carrageenan, no sugar, no maple syrup, no artificial sweeteners, no alcohol, no grains, no starchy vegetables, no potatoes, no corn, no lima beans. And honestly, the one that got me that I could never do this is no coffee. I would be very upset if you took away my coffee. Unfortunately, there's some health benefits to coffee, so I don't feel so guilty about it, but I would be really miserable without my morning coffee. That's just me. Claims of the Whole30, they say that it helps to restore your metabolism, which induces weight loss, may help reduce cravings and reset behavior, boost immunity, reduce inflammation, and heal your digestive tract. So those are some pretty lofty claims. So the pros, obviously, you're not eating much junk food for an entire month. You're not having any alcohol for a month. That's certainly not a bad thing for your body. It may make you more mindful about what you're eating. You will likely lose weight because you're eliminating a lot of processed foods and alcohol and sugar. And they do have some online support and multiple books. The negatives, it's definitely hard to eat out. When I've had clients that have tried to do this sort of diet, it's almost impossible if you're somebody that needs to travel. Not that that matters now, but you know, people are still doing road trips and it's difficult to eat when it's this type of diet. It's also really difficult to socialize because people like to get dessert when they go out for dinner, or they like to have alcohol when they go out to dinner, or they like to order, you know, fill in the blank, a pizza or something like that. So it's difficult to follow this type of diet if you're a social person. The other thing is it lacks vitamins and minerals. So if you're cutting out major food groups, you're going to limit your vitamins, minerals, and fiber in this diet. The big kicker for me, there's no research on it. So they published this diet touting all these claims, and there's absolutely no science behind it. There's probably testimonials. There's probably some anecdotal evidence from different people that have followed this, but there isn't any science behind it. The other thing that a lot of us worry about is the risk for eating disorders. So for somebody that already is at risk for eating disorder or has an eating disorder, being this restrictive is going to put them over the edge. So we really don't recommend this for anybody with binge eating disorder, bulimia, anorexia nervosa, or any other eating disorders. So now I'm going to talk about some of the more popular positive diets that may help you lose weight. So the Mediterranean diet is based on eating patterns of different populations living near the Mediterranean. And we typically hear about France, Greece, Italy, and Spain, but this also takes into account Libya, Turkey, Syria, Morocco, Portugal, Egypt. So it's based on several different eating patterns across the Mediterranean. So it was actually discovered in 1950, or around the 1950s, by somebody named Ansel Keys. And what he found was that heart disease was much lower in poorer sections of Italy. And when you think of people that have food insecurity or that are living in poverty, they're probably not eating as much meat. They might be eating more fish, they might be eating more grains, they might be eating more beans as their protein source. And the diet itself is actually very plant-based. So we see higher intakes of fruits, vegetables, whole grains, beans, healthy fats. Fish, chicken, and dairy are consumed in moderation. And then red meat, sweets, and alcohol are also limited. But for the most part, most foods are included. So that's one really lovely thing about the diet is you really don't have to exclude anything in your diet. You just, still need to eat, food. So when I look at somebody's diet history, I want to make sure there's food in their food. What nutrients are they getting out of what they're eating? So the benefits of the Mediterranean diet, lower rates of heart disease, in women following a Greek-style diet, um, there's lower rates of heart disease, and then lower rates of obesity were seen in adults following an Italian-style eating pattern over 5 years. They have reduced abdominal obesity, which is really important. So when we look at what we call subcutaneous fat versus visceral fat, we want people to lose visceral fat, because visceral fat is the fat that kind of hangs out around your organs that increases your rates of diabetes and heart disease and cancer. Speaking of cancer, one of the biggest benefits of a Mediterranean diet is because it's more plant-based, you're going to be consuming more antioxidants and phytochemicals and fiber. You have lower rates of cancer, specifically colon cancer. So again, if I have a client that has a family history of colon cancer, or they found out that they've got polyps and they have to get their colonoscopy more frequently, I really push lots and lots of fruits and vegetables and other nutrients that are going to be part of a Mediterranean diet. We also see lower rates of diabetes, potentially from high polyphenol intake, which is a nutrient that's found in grapes and raisins and red wine. So it's a type of antioxidant. The other thing with the Mediterranean diet is it's obviously more sustainable because it's a lot less restrictive. So some sample Mediterranean meals are things that you can eat on this particular diet. Things like whole grain cereal and fruit, yogurt with fruit and nuts, whole grain toast with things like peanut butter or almond butter, beans and whole grain pasta, grilled fish over salad, or tomato-based soup with greens. Those are some different ideas of a Mediterranean diet. A DASH diet is very similar to a Mediterranean diet. It stands for Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension. It is also plant-based. It is high in fiber. It's also low in saturated in trans fat, high in calcium, potassium, and magnesium, and then low in sodium. So this type of diet does not include things like monosodium glutamate, soy sauce, teriyaki sauce, barbecue sauce. Those are all going to be limited on a DASH diet because it's based on lowering risk of hypertension. So foods included, it pushes fruits and vegetables a little bit higher than the Mediterranean diet. So fruit and vegetable intake are roughly between 7 to about 9 servings of fruits and vegetables per day. And when you think about that, if you're eating that many fruits and vegetables, that kind of crowds out other foods in your diet. You're not going to have a lot of room for cupcakes and junk food if you're eating more fruits and vegetables. It also includes whole grains and beans, nuts and seeds. Low-fat dairy is included because of calcium. Lean protein sources, again, minimal alcohol, red meat, or processed foods. Again, primarily because of that sodium content, but also because of added sugar. Diet research on the DASH diet, it does help to lower your blood pressure. So following this style of eating reduces your blood pressure within 2 weeks. It's also been found to be beneficial for heart failure. Pardon me, and it also helps to reduce the risk of blood pressure in people with diabetes that have prehypertension. Will it help you lose weight? We'll talk about that. So it helps to reduce your risk for colon cancer, again, because of all those fruits and vegetables and the higher fiber intake, particularly in men. It's also appropriate for women. Perimenopausal women with polycystic ovary syndrome benefit from this diet. And then it may also help with weight loss and clients that have what's called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which is really, we're seeing more rates of that in teenagers because of the rates of obesity. An 8-week trial of the DASH diet showed improvements in LFTs, our liver function tests, and BMI, which is just body mass index. So when they have done studies on weight loss, the thing with the DASH diet is because it has so many fruits and vegetables, you still need to make sure that the calorie level that you're consuming is appropriate. So when we're encouraging dairy products, we're going to encourage low-fat dairy products. When we're encouraging meat or other animal proteins, they should be lean sources or lean cuts of those types of foods. Intermittent fasting has been around for years and years. Several people do fasts for religious reasons. People may do fasts for political reasons, or really fasting itself could be just skipping a meal. That's basically fasting. You're not eating anything. You're in a state of fasting. At night when you're sleeping, you're in a state of fasting. Intermittent fasting is a type of fasting where you're cycling between periods of eating and periods of not eating. It doesn't always necessarily specify what to eat, but the timing of when you're eating. So these are a couple recent books on fasting. One is called The Fast Diet. This is done by a journalist, Dr. Michael Mosley, that was published about 8 years ago, just called The Fast Diet. There's also another one out called the 5-2 diet, which means 5 days of calorie reduction, like moderate calorie reduction, and then 2 days of a hardcore, really low calorie fast. So for women, the recommendation is 2 days at 500 calories, and for men, it's 2 days of 600 calories. And those days are spaced out. So with the 5-2 diet, you would do 5 days of sort of normal eating, and then 2 days of the week you would do a lower calorie diet. And usually you spread that out. So it'd be like Monday and Thursday or Tuesday and Friday that you would do the lower calorie intake. Some people do this type of diet and they kind of base it around when they exercise. So if they're going to, if they're going to run 10 miles, that's not the day they're going to have 500 calories. And honestly, if they're running 10 miles pretty frequently, this type of diet is probably not for them. But you're just not going to get enough calories in to maintain what you're doing. So there are a handful of books out on fasting. Probably the most recent one is The Obesity Code by Dr. Jason Fung. So as I mentioned before, a 5-day or a 5-2 fast, 5 days a week, a person eats a modest amount of calories. So probably 1,600 calories for women, 2,000 to 2,200 for men. And then 2 days a week, you really reduce that amount of calories to like 600 a day for men and about 500 for women, which is not a whole lot of food. So will you lose weight? Absolutely. Any form of calorie restriction is going to result in weight loss. So what happens when you're in a state of fasting, your insulin levels will decrease because the body recognizes that there isn't any sugar floating around in the cells to lower the blood sugar. And then your body will utilize, again, that glycogen that's in storage, as well as some fat that's in storage for calories. And once glycogen is depleted, your body is going to use some fat for calories. So the pros and cons of fasting, obviously, you'll lose weight, might help to lower insulin levels, as well as lipids. So your cholesterol levels might go down with fasting. There's been more and more studies showing that fasting may help to reduce the risk of dementia. Right now, most of those studies are only done in animals, but I imagine more studies are going to come out in humans. We have to test the animals first. The other thing is it's fairly easy to do. Unless you're somebody that's an emotional eater. So again, we worry about people with risk for eating disorder doing these sorts of fasts. The negatives or the cons, your weight loss with this type of diet is very similar to other diets. So I'll give you an example who this would be a good person for. So I had a client recently that doesn't like breakfast, isn't hungry for breakfast, doesn't want to eat breakfast. Okay. He was eating a lot of snacks at night, and so he wasn't really hungry for breakfast, but because he really still wasn't hungry for breakfast, he did really well with intermittent fasting because he just stopped eating after dinner. That's basically what it is. So you stop eating by about 7 p.m., don't have any snacks, and then you eat breakfast, or if you do eat breakfast, you eat it later in the day. So you don't eat anything until 10 or 11 in the morning. Again, the risk for eating disorders is much higher when people are fasting. Most of the time, people are just advised not to eat or drink anything later in the day. So for people that maybe work night shifts, or they work an evening shift and they get off really late at night, or they, their meals are later because of whatever type of work they do or whatever type of schedule they keep, that might be kind of difficult. So those are some of the negatives. An intermittent fast is a little bit different. So different than a 5-2 fast. You want to fast for at least 12 hours. Your meals and calories typically are advised to be earlier in the day. As I mentioned, that one client doesn't eat until, that should be AM, not 10 p.m. So he doesn't have anything to eat, or you don't have what I'm trying to say is your feeding time, or the time that you have meals, is between something like 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. And then you don't have anything after 7 p.m. and you don't have anything until 10 a.m. the next morning. So basically it's equivalent to skipping breakfast and then not having any snacks after. Again, what will happen is that your insulin level will drop and your body will use fat that's in storage for calories. Now, the thing is, you still need to meet basic calorie needs. You still need to eat enough calories in that feeding time, in that window of 8 hours, in order for your body to not feel like it's starving. Because if it does, then your body's going to also use some protein for calories, and that's where you'll lose muscle. Fasting is never advised for anybody that's pregnant or breastfeeding. Anybody dealing with eating disorders, we don't advise fasting. Anybody that's hospitalized or immunocompromised, or patients that have diabetes or on insulin, we do not advise fasting. And the reason that you wouldn't with somebody that's hospitalized or immunocompromised is that they need the calories to survive. So I see that somebody's raised their hand. We're almost done with the presentation, so
it has to do with the fast.
Maybe you could hold your question until the end.
Okay.
What was that?
It has to do with the fasting.
Yes.
I have an ostomy, so staying hydrated is very important for me. With the fasting, does it matter if you're like intaking water or beverages with electrolytes in it?
That is a great question. So with fasting, you can have anything that is calorie-free. And I would definitely recommend water. So if you're somebody that has an ostomy and you do need to stay hydrated. So yes, you can have water, you can have something like G2, like Gatorade, without any calories in it. In order to maintain your electrolytes, that's perfectly fine. You can have sugar-free Kool-Aid, you can have Crystal Light, you can have coffee, but you can't, or tea, but you can't put anything in it. So you can't put, milk or cream or sugar or honey when you're fasting. That's a great question. Yeah. So a little bit on exercise. We know exercise induces a calorie deficit, helps to build muscle, aids in fat loss, particularly that visceral fat loss that I mentioned earlier, improves your sleep, which is also important to weight control, helps to boost immunity. So exercise actually helps your body It also helps to reduce depression, which is very important when you're trying to lose weight, because a lot of people stress eat. I've been writing a little series called the COVID-15, talking about how to manage your weight, during their pandemic. So there's been a handful of studies that weight gain is pretty common right now because of stress eating. The other thing is everybody's discovered sourdough, which is lovely, but we are cooking more, we're eating more at home, we're confined to home, our gyms have been closed, or we have minimal access. And so some things that you can do during this time are, get outside. I mean, I've been working from home quite a bit, and I sit in my dining room and I can't help but see everybody walking by, whether it's walking their dogs, taking their strollers out with their kids, or they're just out there by themselves. And it actually encourages me to get outside and just go for a walk. Get your bikes out if you can. There's actually a bike shortage now, though, because again, people are trying to find things to do. So when we can't go out to dinner, we can't go to movies, we're kind of taking it to the streets. So we're getting outside, which is good. You can hike pretty safely. You can play tennis. It's fairly socially distanced. You can golf. And then if you are home and you're concerned about getting out, there are some exercise apps, and these are just a handful of exercise apps that are free that you could download on your phone or your tablet or your laptop or something, and do some exercise at home. So just in conclusion, fad diets are going to persist, and so does obesity. So you have to kind of look at weight loss as a journey. Any diet that you follow will help lose weight, but at what cost? So to me, when I counsel people, I typically ask them what's worked for you before, what are you comfortable with, what can you afford, and what do you think is going to be sustainable? Because I kind of refuse to put somebody on a fad diet or suggest it, because I know it's not going to be beneficial in the long run or be healthy. Lower carb diets may help people with insulin resistance, but we do need more long-term studies. And, for now, calorie reduction and exercise, sadly, it's not sexy, but that's what works long-term to help maintain loss. And then if I have any questions, feel free to chime in. And then if you're on any kind of social media and you want to follow me, I tend to post quite a few recipes on my website at least once a week. And then I post articles that I've written either on LinkedIn or Twitter or Instagram. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to chime in. Thank you. Do I have any